Great. Right, off we go then. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Tara. And yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the talk this evening. A little bit about me. So I'm a lifelong naturalist. I've spent pretty much every minute of my spare time since I could walk, pootling around the outdoors, picking up anything I could fit into my pockets. And it got to the point where my parents had a rule that I was only allowed to bring home what I could carry on my person. So I bought the biggest old jacket I could, I asked to have the biggest old jacket that I was allowed, and this one of the photo on the left there, which had lots of pockets, and the six-year-old me used to go down and stuff my pockets full of any old feathers and bones and interesting looking rocks, had bits of wood, dead animals, owl pellets, whatever I could find. Used to come home and sit on my nature shelf, and then presumably get gradually whisked away by my ever understanding parents. And that sort of spawned a career, I suppose. I read zoology at uni, and after pinballing for a few different careers, ended up becoming a wildlife filmmaker, and that's the job I do today. I'm passionate about communicating the stories of our natural world. I think there are unlimited phenomenal stories that we can share from across the planet, and most recently, along with Hilary, a member of your group, I helped make the Wild Isles series, which has been a real passion project for me because I'm a particular fan of British nature. Alongside that, I co-authored a book, which is the subject of the talk tonight. Orchard is both hardback and paperback now, and was written with my good friend Benedict MacDonald, and we spent more than 7 years trying to get under the skin of one particular old orchard in Herefordshire. And so this is sort of the behind the scenes of that book and how we got to the place where we decided to write about an orchard. The book was an accident. We never set out to write a book. It began with me bumping into Ben on a former project that we worked on together, a show called Springwatch. Ben had told me about this orchard that he'd found by scouring Google Maps. We met the owners, and there's this whole story of how we eventually ended up writing the book that we did. Initially, the project of the orchard started as a friendship, two naturalists who wanted to go and explore this particular habitat. And what really stuck out about this particular orchard was the fact that it still had a good number of some of our absolute rarest species, redstarts, spotted flycatchers, lesser spotted woodpeckers, good numbers of marsh tits and song thrushes, and birds that were both on the very rare end of the spectrum, and also more familiar birds which are red listed because they're declining so quickly. And we wanted to know what it was and that made this orchard work. And so we began with this nest box project. We would go up there during the autumn and winter. We flooded the place with nest boxes of all different types. We tried some new designs of nest box, and we worked on a number of proven designs to try and really understand what it was about this system that made it work, and try and document the productivity of it. We were getting nests of redstart with 6 eggs in, for example, which is quite unusual. So we gradually developed year on year these field diaries, these notes. This is a typical scene on a winter's day, probably around 2015 time. We'd fill up either my old Saab or Ben's old Golf with a pile of nest boxes. We'd trudge up the M5. We'd head north at Ledbury, and we'd go and visit this orchard. And we'd clean them all out, and over the years we just built up this amazing library of knowledge about the life that lived in that particular orchard. The orchard was a traditional standard orchard, not one of these modern espaliered orchards that you see that look a bit more like a grapevine, a vineyard. This was a classic old sort of British orchard, the large standard trees, and it was being managed very much for nature. The owners only took a small harvest of Perry pears from it. It was a cider orchard, but it also had an eating apple and a cooking apple section, along with a few other fruit trees like plums and pears in there. And this is what we would find in when we came back to visit our boxes in spring. We'd scour all of our boxes and we'd put together this knowledge of all the different species that were breeding there. And obviously, you're only attracting your cavity nesting species to a box. There are lots of species like blackbird and song thrush that won't readily nest in a box or a box type design. They prefer to build their own nest in a hedge or against a wall. So the cavity nesting species, species like redstart, like spotted flycatcher, will nest in an open cavity, and particularly the tits that you can see in this picture here. The top left, I think, is marsh tit, and then blue tit, and then bottom middle is great tit. Bottom left are some redstart eggs there, and we built up this knowledge base of all of the different creatures that were using it, and then we realized actually alongside that that knowledge base that we had of the smaller birds that we use in the boxes, we paired that with actually searching around and finding the wild nests and starting to understand a bit about the productivity. It was extraordinary, the density of birds that we were finding. The orchard is surrounded by these huge old hedgerows that are left wide and high on purpose. And we'd work each hedgerow in turn. And when you're going looking for nests, you use sort of a nesting stick. And we'd gently tap along, and you'd hear an adult bird pop off its nest. You just hear a scurrying through the branches, and you'd find something like a song thrush nest or a blackbird nest in every single hedge around this orchard, which was amazing. Because if you go to most habitats today, you have to work pretty hard to find those breeding species. And all of that is really valuable data. That data gets submitted to the BTO. We monitor it and we give that data to them so they can understand productivity, how the nests are doing, what's the return between number of eggs laid versus number of chicks fledged. And we were just gradually building up more of a picture as to what made it work. One of the best things about going up to the orchard during that breeding season is getting there for the dawn chorus, because if you can imagine the dawn chorus in a typical woodland, it was like that but on steroids. The productivity of an old, essentially organic cider orchard replicates this wood pasture habitat, and it had such a diversity of species that the dawn chorus was absolutely spectacular. And these are just a few of the wild type nests that we would find. Top left is a robin. Bottom left is a chiffchaff. The middle there, those are starling chicks, almost ready to fledge in one of the old green woodpecker cavities. Top right is a wren nest, and bottom left are those beautiful sort of blue-green eggs of a song thrush in that wood chip lined nest. And so beginning to build up this picture. We've got all of the cavity nesting species in our boxes, and then we did some wild nesting to find the species that don't choose to nest in boxes. And we're building up this knowledge base. And we were able to then, after a few years, step back a little bit and say, what is it? What is it about this system that makes it so productive? As naturalists, we were fascinated by this system which is farmland, but it was phenomenally productive for wildlife. And so we looked at it and we broke it down into three key areas. There was a lot of nutrient recycling in the orchard, a good number of predators, and it was very clear that there were no pesticides, no inputs going in. And so this is a typical shot of the orchard in early spring before budburst. You'd see lots of deadwood on the ground. Over the winter, the storms had come through and they peel off branches left, right, and centre. There was a fairly high mistletoe load in the orchard, which was creating opportunities for fungi to get into the branches. And the owners were very happy to let some of these trees become infested with mistletoe over time, to the point where you would end up with a lot of deadwood. And that, I think, is a key part of the system. I've traveled extensively throughout Europe because I'm a big fan of European wildlife and European megafauna. And I've seen those real primeval wild woodlands that you have in places like the Białowieża in East Poland. And in those systems, you see deadwood everywhere, in every stage of decay, from fresh branches, through to standing deadwood, through to deadwood on the ground, through to deadwood decades old that you can crumble in your hands, but still loosely holds the structure of the tree which it once came from. And that is something which is chronically missing from the vast majority of our landscape. We have a dangerous habit in this country of removing deadwood from the system. And there's common facts about how much life something like an oak tree supports. An oak tree supports over 300 different species of insect. Well, half the species of invertebrate that an oak tree supports live on the deadwood. They're not living on the live wood. They're not living on the leaf. They're living on that deadwood. And pretty much all of our woodland associated fungi are reliant on not the live part of the tree, but the dead part of the tree. They're exploiting that nutrient that's been put into the tree during its life. When it dies, the fungi and the mycelium can then get into that tree. And we've become sort of culturally accustomed to not seeing deadwood. Parks remove deadwood almost immediately. But we could see that with the volume of deadwood in that habitat, it was providing food for so many other species. It was also providing habitat. So alongside creating species for everything from wood-boring beetles through to fungi, it was also providing really critical habitat. This is a hollowed out tree trunk that in that year it had a blackbird in the middle of the cavity, and it had a wren stuffed onto the epicormic growth that was all decaying on the outside of the outside of that tree. And so deadwood provides these sort of little mini fortress areas that the birds can nest in. And obviously, small mammals and other creatures benefit from that. This is a picture of one of the trees that have been left standing. You can see on the left there that it's very much a deceased tree, but there's a huge volume of standing deadwood there. And it's been completely infested with this small bracket fungi called a turkey tail. And you can see in the close-up on the right why that fungi is called a turkey tail. And that's a species which will wet rot the wood, and then by wet rotting the wood, you'll then get other species move in that can use that weakened wood. It also provides a great excavation site for species like woodpeckers. And some of the trees rotted the other way around. They had rotted from the hollowed out cores, and they'd work out. And this was a much harder type of rot. And these cavities are often exploited by birds like jackdaws. This is one such nest in one of the very old trees in the orchard, which was entirely hollowed out. A 6-egg nest of jackdaws, again, quite an unusual brood size. Jackdaws will normally have 4 or 5 chicks, but in a high productive system, birds will often lay an extra egg and just wing it and see, will they make it? So these jackdaws put out 6 eggs that year and hatched out a whole bund of little chicks. And there were lots of different nests like this across the orchard. There was a really old section of the orchard, well over 100 years old, that had these hollowed out trees that had the bulk of the jackdaw colony in. And each part of the orchard had its different character. That recycling of nutrients doesn't just happen to the deadwood, it happens to the fruit. A lot of the fruit in this orchard was allowed to fall to the ground, and that was feeding the wildlife that came through. If you're familiar with orchards, you'll know that in winter, any fruit on the ground is an absolute magnet for winter thrushes. This year is going to be a spectacular year for these birds. It's a very bad mast year in Scandinavia, and we've already got the redwings and fieldfares in. But if you look at the reports on bird guides, you can see that this year is going to be a big waxwing winter as well. We've already had flocks of hundreds coming over up in the northeast. And as they work their way through the fruit and red berries up in the northeast, by February time, we should be seeing waxwings down in the local Tesco car parks around us, I'm sure. And so many different species benefit from both the food that rotting wood is providing and the habitats. There's a queen hornet overwintering that I found in one of the old woodpecker cavities there. And obviously, one of the main groups of insects that are declining in Britain are our beetles. Well, deadwood is a huge source of food for them. This is a rhinoceros who I found, and she was actually off to lay eggs. And you can find that you can see the males sticking their heads out, buried in there, waiting for a mate to come by. This is one of the beetles that was just using the deadwood as a habitat. So this is a slug-eating beetle, and there are so many different species that can use that deadwood, and it's left on the ground both as habitat and food. Next up were our predators. This was a system where it's quite rare to see a full complement of predators in any ecosystem today in Britain. We've adjusted them so much through hunting, through extinction, through continued pressure for pheasant shooting interests, or in some cases farming interests. But here in the orchard, there were half a dozen pairs of tawny owls, a pair of barn owls, a pair of kestrels. There were I'd be walking through the orchard and sometimes I'd just bump into a young tawny owl sitting on a branch. This would have been in like, April, May time. Tawny owls will nest very early in the season if they've got enough food. You can see there are no leaves on the tree yet, even on that apple tree, yet that tawny owl has already fledged, or at least branched. They climb out the nest and branch first before they actually take off and fledge. There was a pair of goshawks, which took us a long time to find. You would have buzzards going over. And we'd have frequent sparrowhawks through the orchard. And then, a few years into study, we realized actually there were many polecats. Herefordshire is a real polecat hotspot. And by putting up our camera traps, we were able to find not just polecats, but that we found some interesting prints in the mud once on the small stream that forms in the winter around the back of the orchard. And we captured this. That is the rear end of an otter disappearing up into this ephemeral stream that appears in the winter. That otter had come from the river about 1 kilometre away, had come up this flooded ditch, and it was working its way up to the woodland on the back of the orchard, where there was a huge frog spawning pond. And we're pretty certain that otter could smell that in the water coming down, and it was working its way up to hunt those frogs. Otters love finding a good frog spawning pond because they enjoy hunting frogs. And there was one year we found a stoat up a tree raiding the jackdaw nest. There's a big badger set. There'll be hedgehogs in the brash piles. In the summer, the hobbies migrate over and they'll be hunting the hirundines, the swallows and martins, and they'll also hunt swifts that would be feeding over the orchard. So it was clear that, aside from those large carnivores, the lynx and etc. that have gone entirely and hopefully will be put back one day, there were these good class of mesopredators and a particular good class of avian predators that were working this orchard and helping keep that checks and balances in place. And then finally, we're certain that an organic approach at the orchard is critical to the health of the soil and the health of the overall system. By not spraying with insecticides, the number of predatory insects were regulating that system. We just didn't find things like greenfly explosion on the trees. Because it was incredibly easy in season to find ladybirds, and obviously ladybird larvae are a major predator of so many of the pests of commercially grown fruit and veg. And we would be able to find these large invertebrates, species like the rhinoceros beetle that I mentioned in that picture on the left. There's the caterpillar of an eyed hawk moth on one of the apple trees. I don't know if you can see it there in the middle. There's a better image of it, a really well camouflaged, huge hawk moth caterpillar, this one, good few inches long. And species like that are declining very rapidly across the wider countryside through loss of habitat and through pesticide exposure. We have a class of pesticides that are just so efficient that these macro invertebrates, the large invertebrates, simply cannot survive, and they've been overwhelmingly lost from invertebrate counts. That's what that caterpillar turns into. This absolutely stunning species of hawk moth. We would, do any soil samples, you'd find be full of worms. And on that picture on the right, that's what happens when you leave grass rank over the winter. It creates a habitat, and in the bottom of the habitat are all the grass moth caterpillars. So that pile of caterpillars there, I lifted up some of this wet grass, that rank grass that you leave in the winter. And you peel it up, and underneath you've got this layer of soil which is kept slightly warmer by the grass that's rotting over the top of it. And inside there, you've got all of these overwintering caterpillars just lying on the ground. I picked up that handful in about 20 seconds. Again, providing so much food for creatures that aren't hibernating, and obviously providing that year-on-year cycling. And one thing that we do, we overmanage the countryside. We mow unnecessarily. We remove habitat, not just at the adult life stage of species, like moths. We remove them at their egg stage and their caterpillar stage, and we destroy them at their chrysalis stage through turning over the soil. And so just by leaving large areas of rank grassland, you're creating the conditions that allow so many different species to thrive. And moths in particular are really impacted by mechanical damage, not pesticide exposure, which they are damaged by, but mechanical damage, removing key stages of their life cycle. When we mow, we take out those eggs, we take out those caterpillars that are obviously needed for the adult forms the following season. This is a vapor moth caterpillar that was up in one of the new trees. Cockchafers, when we did When we did any moth sampling with a light trap, we'd often get cockchafers come in, maybugs. They've got an interesting story. If you count the fronds on the antennae, you can sex them. So the males have got 7 little fronds on their antennae, and the females have only got 6. So if you ever get a maybug fly into your face in the spring, you can grab it and have a quick look and work out whether it's a male or a female before you set it on its way. So alongside building up these field diaries and this knowledge of both the nesting and what made the orchard tick, I then began to, I'm really enjoy photography. I then began to build rigs that allowed me to capture those moments in those creatures' lives. And, I'm really interested in fieldcraft. I'm really interested in understanding how an animal lives in its habitat. So trying to get those animal and landscape shots. But the very first photo I took was a missel thrush nest. Missel thrushes are a red-listed bird species. They're doing very badly across the UK. Year-on-year declines for the past few decades. But at the orchard, consistently, a good few pairs every year would breed. And one year they decided to nest up in the top of a Leylandii. So I climbed up there and got this first photo, which was out of focus and slightly annoys me every time I look at it. But this was the very first photo I took that showed a bird in the orchard feeding its chicks. And from there I developed my techniques, and I've been gradually working on different ways that allow me to capture those animals in their habitat, doing what they do, which is normally rearing the families. So I'm just going to show you a few of those photos, take you through the year in the life of an old country orchard, and just talk a bit about the background on each one. So to give you a bit of a geography overview, the orchard, I call it the orchard, but it's actually split into 3 orchards: Oak Orchard, Hopkiln Orchard, and Maze Orchard. And each of them, as I alluded to earlier, has a different character. They've got their different, big trees. Some of them have got, a line of willows or, a few big old oak trees. But we had this map commissioned by an artist which sits at the beginning of the book, just to try and give the lay of the land, and we're referring to different points within it. And I think that just sort of helps set the scene. But we do, when we speak about the orchard, it's all of those. It encompasses all of that you can see on the screen there. So spring, this is a male redstart with a false click beetle in his beak, about to take it back to his nest. Spring seems to be a month just full of bees, blossom bulbs, bees, butterflies, bugs, and breeding. It's the month where everything just really starts to fizz. So I'll start there. The blossom display in the orchard, because those hedges are left so wide, because they're left high, and because they're old, is simply fantastic. You've got the blackthorn blossom that you can see here that comes out, and there's a lot of different nectar. That early nectar flow, that early supply, particularly of tree flowers, is absolutely critical for those early invertebrates. And that's why cutting hedgerows at the right time of the year and cutting them in succession is so important. Because you need to allow the right age of limb for those flowers to blossom off. So willows, hazels, in this picture blackthorn and hawthorn are 4 really critical species that are needed for invertebrates at the beginning of the year, when there's not much flowers, a few bulb species, but there's not much nectar and pollen coming from the flowers. It's the tree species that carry the overwhelming weight of the nectar and pollen early in the season. And so species like this tree bumblebee here, they search out, and if you find one of the willow trees on an early spring day that's in full blossom, it's alive. You can hear it fizzing, because so many different species of invertebrate, particularly those bees that have come out of hibernation, that are looking to crank up their metabolism and get going and get breeding, they will seek those out. And now with warmer winters, we're sometimes getting bumblebee queens coming out in January and February looking for that, and they're coming out too early. The trees are responding, and trees are beginning to flower earlier, but we've got this slight mismatch at the moment where if a bumblebee queen comes out too early, there's simply no nectar in the landscape. But if she manages to stay dormant until late February, she's normally got a good chance of finding some of that tree nectar and can fuel up ready to kickstart her nest building. And obviously, once you get into March, April, you're beginning to see those woodland flowers coming out, some of the bulb nesting or bulb growing or tuber growing species like bluebell and primrose that you can see there. But there's one early spring flower that I always love looking for, and that's the cuckoo flower. And the reason I love looking for that is it's the food plant for the orange tip butterfly caterpillars. So if you look at this picture on the left, that's what the whole flower looks like. They'll flower really early. You can see them out in April, and by May, there's early May, there's normally a good profusion of them. And they're one of the first butterflies to emerge, and they've timed their emergence to coincide with the emergence of their food plant, or the food plant of their caterpillar. And in that middle photo, I hope you can see there's a little tiny orange egg there, that single egg. Now each caterpillar, each butterfly will only lay one egg per plant. And you'll find that if you go and look closely at the flowers and pick out each individual plant, orange tip, cuckoo flower plant, you can, at that time of year, late April time, if you turn it over, you'll almost certainly, if you're in an area where there are orange tips, which they're fairly widely distributed, you'll almost certainly find either one of those orange eggs or a little tiny black caterpillar, and that's the caterpillar of the orange tip butterfly. And the female will only lay one egg on each plant because the caterpillars are cannibalistic. So the first thing the female does, she'll find that cuckoo flower, she'll look over it, see if there are any caterpillars. If there aren't, she'll lay her egg on it and then move on to the next one. She'll do that and she'll lay hundreds, 100+ eggs. She'll need to find 100 different flowers. So it shows how important, those meadows are, those meadow systems that have got a good diversity and good numbers, good abundance of flowers in, because it's only if there are 100 cuckoo flowers in a meadow system that just one female orange tip can lay all of her eggs in the season. And then you start to get some of your earliest breeding species. Missel thrushes, this is the nest of a missel thrush. They lay incredibly conspicuous nests. They're not very good nesters. And so a lot of those early nests get predated. And we're wondering if it's a strategy. We wonder if they go through that effort of building the nest, or if there are just too many magpies and jays in the orchard, one of the two of the main predators. But with the good numbers of goshawk and other predators, we think that the orchard is roughly in balance. And it might just be that the missel thrush's strategy is to make multiple nests in the season such that there are many hiding around, and that the jays and magpies, when they look in the nest, more often than not, will find an empty nest. But eventually the missel thrushes will manage to get a nest away. And we do often find them with 2, 3, or 4 chicks in. And they're, again, for such a rare species, it's great to see them doing well in the orchard. So the missel thrushes will use wool, sheep's wool, in their nests. You can see here around the edge, you got moss and sheep's wool. What's happened here is that a missel thrush has built its nest in amongst the mistletoe, and it's, for whatever reason, that nest has stopped being used. And then a song thrush has come along and built its nest on top of the missel thrush cavity. And what you're seeing there is a song thrush nest with 4 song thrush chicks poking their head out, begging to be fed in amongst that shroud of mistletoe. Nuthatches are really getting going by this point. Again, they use these little tiny pellets of mud, and they'll take a big cavity and they'll narrow that cavity down. So in this picture here, the top 2/3 of that cavity have been filled in by the adult nuthatches using little pellets of mud, and only a nuthatch-sized hole at the bottom there is left open. And a bit like you'll see some of the hornbill species in the tropical rainforest, the female will stay inside the cavity brooding the eggs, and the male will go out and find food. Nuthatches do something very similar. Although in the hornbills, the female is actually clay-walled into the tree. In nuthatches, she can leave if she wants to. If she gets hungry or she needs to defecate, she will go and leave the nest for a bit. But it'll be the male doing a lot of the work when she's brooding those chicks when they're little. And then as they're old enough to hold their own body heat, then both male and female will go and leave. But we get some wonderful moments where we would see the male coming back. He would be carrying a large grub of some sort. He would get near to the cavity entrance, he would call her, she would come out and grab it, or he would go into the cavity and pop in and feed her inside the nest, like he's done in this video here. And so just building up this knowledge base of how those creatures are using the orchard, season on season. And each season we find something slightly different. And there he comes out there carrying a little fecal pellet that he will drop off somewhere. This is a family of blue tits. This is actually a composite image, so I've stitched 2 images together, the 2 birds on the left and the one on the right, and that sort of demonstrates how a blue tit family are using. You'll often see the male at the nest, he will have finished feeding the chicks, and the female will come in and they'll swap, and it's this constant hive of activity. And this is just in a natural rock cavity. This young chick, you can see the blue tit chick there is almost ready to fledge. maybe another few days and that chick will have finished. They'll sometimes only stay in the nest for sort of 14, 16 days once they've fledged, 20 days and they're off and out. The birds that we really loved looking for in the orchards were the woodpeckers. I've got a particular passion for finding woodpeckers. They tend to be a little bit rarer than the birds, and they're very specialist with the way they use their habitat. And old orchards, particularly as I mentioned, ones that are allowing that deadwood to stay standing on the tree, that have got those natural fungi infections, that have got that soft rot in them, become brilliant habitats. Woodpeckers will seek those out, find those soft rot areas, excavate their cavity. And if any of you've got the Collins Bird Guide, a very classic picture in a Collins, in any bird guide, is of a woodpecker nest underneath a bracket fungi. And that's where the bracket fungi is using the trees, deadwood obviously for its own nutrition, and the woodpecker has exploited that rot and hammered it out. And so here you can see and hear a great spot bringing back food. This is the female great spotted woodpecker. And hopefully you can hear how vocal those chicks are. And that's a brilliant way of finding woodpecker nests. If you wander through a woodland, in the south in May, maybe in the Midlands and north in June, you will sometimes hear this loud, shrill begging sound. Because by the end of May, by that first week or second week of June, those chicks are really vocal. They're constantly begging for food from the parents, and that's how we often find those woodpecker nests in the orchard. And we'll sometimes take an endoscope and listen. And listen for the nests, and then count how many chicks are in those cavities. And almost always we'll find 2 or 3 pairs of great spotted woodpeckers. Now, great spotted woodpeckers got a really interesting relationship with starlings. Some of you may know that starlings are another one of our red listed species, and they're actually doing pretty well in the orchard. The reason starlings one of the reasons starlings are in decline is a complete collapse in their food. They rely heavily on leather jackets. Leather jackets live in the soil because the way we manage a lot of our soils now, heavy intensive use of pesticide, that those leather jackets are considered a pest. They're killed off. Starlings can't find enough food for their chicks and they decline. But there's another really interesting relationship. Today, most starlings nest in artificial cavities, roofs and nest boxes, that sort of thing. But before people came along, starlings obviously didn't have those, and their relationship was with woodpeckers. Starlings would fight woodpeckers, particularly great spotted woodpeckers. They would wait until great spotted woodpeckers had finished excavating their cavities around April time. The starlings would, or sometimes even March time, the starlings, where they're going, they beat up the great spotted woodpeckers and steal their nest cavity. And starlings in these traditional systems, like old orchards, do still have this behavior where they're using woodpecker holes to nest. And that managed to keep the woodpecker numbers in some degree of check. A natural predation events of a great spotted woodpecker from something like a sparrowhawk will keep their numbers down, but actually disrupting their breeding cycle, which is what the starlings were doing, will also prevent them from exploding in numbers. Now what we're seeing is a huge explosion in great spotted woodpecker numbers. They do very, very well on peanut feeders in gardens, and starlings are no longer competing with them for cavities. And so our great spotted woodpecker numbers are actually going through the roof. And that's a problem because great spotted woodpeckers are really prolific predators of many different cavity nesting birds. So you'll have birds like, this is a great tit chick, which has been hammered out of its nest cavity by this female great spotted woodpecker. The great spotted woodpecker then takes it to an anvil. It'll wedge the chick in a tree. It'll pull off a leg, and then it'll pull off another leg. And it'll take these back one at a time and feed them to its chicks, because a good way to get a big shot of protein into those chicks when they're getting ready to fledge isn't to go and find bigger bugs. It's to go and find small chicks from cavity nesting birds. And so we see this regularly in the orchard. We'll be following some nests, and then we'll go back one day and they will have been hammered out by great spotted woodpeckers looking to get that boost of protein to those chicks in their last few weeks before the great spotted woodpecker chicks get ready to fledge. Wrens are super prolific. I love finding their little tennis ball sized nests made of moss. And then towards the end of spring we see the arrival of the migrants that come over from particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and I really enjoy getting that seep of the flycatchers arrive. The spotted flycatchers are one of the later nesting species that arrive in the orchard. And that early summer, that sort of June, mid-June period is when the orchard really comes to life. The early nesting species are all got their chicks fledging. The summer arrivals are all on their nests, like the spotted flycatchers, and the fruit is beginning to come onto the trees as well. That early blossom is now converting into fruit, and the understory in the orchard, that meadow system, is coming to full flower. The trees took that early burden of providing the pollen and nectar to the system, and by the time you get into summer, it's the wildflowers that take over, and the wildflowers are providing the bulk of nectar and pollen. And with that comes the sound of the grasshoppers and things beginning to come out and reproduce. I love spotted flycatchers because they're incredibly loyal. They will fly. This little bird flies down through Europe, over the Mediterranean, down through Africa, across the Sahara, and winters in sub-Saharan Africa. And following spring, it flies up. And by early summer, by June, you get them arriving back in the orchard, and they go back to the exact same cavity that they used to nest in. So this female nested in this brick cavity for 5 years running. And it was great to wait and get back to the orchard in June and find that moment where, yep, she's back, she's chosen a mate, and they're nesting in that cavity. And presumably it's multiple generations. Maybe it was a chick from a previous generation that came back and nested in that exact cavity. But that cavity was nested in for 6 years consecutively while we were there. And then, and for the last few years, it's just stopped being used. And that's systematic of that wider decline, or indicative of that wider decline that we're seeing in these migratory birds having increasingly tougher migrations. And either that population that were nesting in that brick, that gene pool have gone, or as a result of that migration, or for some other reason. But sadly, we're not seeing them nesting in that dislodged brick anymore. And we think there's probably fledged hundreds of chicks from that dislodged brick over the years. She'll nest in a shallow depression there. She likes a bit of an open cavity that she can look out from. Spotted flycatchers, when they nest, sit very low in the nest, but this little tiny black marble of an eye looks out, constantly scanning. And they sit low in the nest, but they always want to be seeing out from it, unlike something like a blueted, obviously, which is hiding well inside the box. Redstarts, by summer, they're already on eggs and sometimes on chicks. And it's great fun watching the redstarts. And this is the sort of photo I was trying to get, that shows the way that a redstart is using that orchard environment. It's using that little cavity that you can see there in the bottom of that tree. I just really enjoy trying to show those animals in their landscapes. Same with a tree creeper. There's a tree creeper bringing back a beak full of crane fly larvae, bark lice, and some green caterpillar there to its nest. And look at how the tree creeper uses that forked tail. Those two feathers in its tail, and it's got a few more tail feathers, are very, very stiff. And they use it a bit like a tripod. So they've got their two little sharp feet, and their tail feather, it locks in, and that's like a tripod that binds them. And that's how they're able to scurry so close to the branch or a tree trunk as they work their way back into their nest. And so if you want to make a nest site for a tree creeper, the best thing you can do is find a bit of peeling bark and just prop a very thin piece of wood, no more than about 12, 14 mil, a finger's width worth of wood. Just prop that little bit of bark off from the tree trunk, and a tree creeper will find that and use that as its nest cavity. They can get into a narrower nest than any other bird and cavity nesting bird in Britain. But the holy grail, the species that we always look for every year in the orchard, was the lesser spotted woodpecker. Lesser spotted woodpeckers are in catastrophic decline across Britain. They're an incredibly rare species. And just to give some idea of how small this little bird is, this is a lesser spotted woodpecker that I had commissioned. So that's it for scale. It's about the size of a house sparrow. This is an apple I use for scale. This is about the size of a normal Granny Smith. So lesser spotted woodpeckers are tiny compared to their great spotted cousins. And if you've been fortunate enough to see one of these, then you're very lucky, because there are probably fewer than 500 pairs now. There are only a few strongholds, Sherwood Forest, the New Forest, and the Malvern Hills, where lesser spotted woodpeckers are still clinging on. But overwhelmingly, a combination of factors, particularly food loss and habitat loss, have caused the numbers to plummet. But in the orchard, they're clinging on, they're managing to rear families, and we're delighted each year when we find the pair somewhere in the orchard that are nesting in those trees. The entrance hole, here's a video of them. That entrance hole is about the size of a 2p to a 50p piece, so really small, entrance hole that those woodpeckers will use. You can see in the bottom left of your screen there, it's just flown in. She's, what was that, he? He's got a beak full of caterpillars, green caterpillars. That's a really healthy praise. Out comes the female, in goes the male. Tiny little woodpecker. Just get that scale. This is literally, a house sparrow, blue tit, great tit sized bird, really tiddly relative to the great spotted woodpeckers. But the problem is some years they will get eaten as well by those great spotted woodpeckers, and because great spotted woodpeckers are doing so well, they are a natural predator of the lesser spotted woodpeckers. This is a wonderful photo that my friend Sam Hobson took of the lesser spotted woodpeckers one year. I was away on shoot filming somewhere, and so we invited Sam up to capture this because they were in a really pretty nest that year. And I'm still very jealous of this photo. I never got to see this nest, and that tree has now fallen over actually because it was so infested with wet rot. But by leaving that deadwood in the environment, the owners of this orchard have created the conditions that allow species like the lesser spotted woodpecker to thrive. And sometimes they're not in the tree. Sometimes they're not on the orchard trees. There's this huge line of old willows that bisect two of the orchards. And when you're looking for a bird the size of a house sparrow nesting right up in the top of one of these massive old fortress cathedral-sized willows, it can be a real challenge to look for that little 50p size entrance hole. But occasionally we're successful, and this nest was one such of those. This woodpecker was nesting, 10 meters up in the canopy, and great to watch and see just how small it was relative to the big trees that it was nesting in. By summer, you've got all of your invertebrates going in full swing as well. These are one of the paper wasp species, and they're nesting in a hole in the ground. And you can see, if you look closely, in their mandibles, in their mouth parts, they're carrying these little pellets of mud. The wasp will go underground and they just start this conveyor belt, and they'll excavate an area the size of a watermelon from underground, and they'll build their nest. And occasionally you find those holes where a badger has found that and dug the whole thing out and eaten that wasp nest. But if you find a nice productive grassland, you'll often find one of these nests, and it's just a very small, looks like a vole hole, and you'll see the wasps going in and out and either excavating or taking food in for the nest they've already formed underground. So that goes through spring and summer. By autumn, most of those summer migrants are working their way back down through Europe, back across the Mediterranean to their wintering grounds. But it's a bit of a changing of the guard, because at the same time, you start to get those first migrants coming over from Scandinavia. And as we've seen this year, we've got huge numbers of redwings and fieldfares, waxwings. You also get a lot of coal tits and other tit species. We got all the starlings come over. And what they're looking for, the reason those birds are migrating to Britain, is they're looking for food. We've got a mild climate thanks to the Gulf Stream, and the fact that we're surrounded by water. Even for the same latitudes, we've got much warmer winters. And so if you can provide habitat in which there's lots of food, as a traditional orchard system does, these habitats can be full of life. This is just, and obviously the final part is, of course, you've got the harvest. And this is just where the bottles are stored at the orchard. It's this wonderful old press. And the owners, in the 50s and 60s, they actually rigged up an old motorbike to press the fruit, and then put an electric motor on that. And now they use a much smaller system, which is far more efficient. But they've left that all in situ, and it's a wonderful thing to go and visit. The field fairs, as I spoke to earlier, get there early to an orchard, and there's lots of good orchards that are still dotted around the place. Get early to an orchard on a winter's day, sit there quietly and wait for that influx of the winter thrushes to come in, all jostling and fighting over that fallen fruit on the ground. And these big missel thrushes, you've got that, big missel, big field fares. You've got the redwings coming in, you have blackbirds, song thrushes, all of these birds working together, feeding on that fallen fruit. Typical winter's day scene here. You've got some of the real veteran trees. These are the ones I spoke about earlier. These very gnarled old trees, full of almost hollowed out, full of cavities. Maybe a dozen pairs of jackdaws nesting across there, 2 or 3 pairs in each of these old trees. A pair in each limb. This tree on the right here, that one has got 3 pairs of jackdaws in, and actually the top limb on that tree has now decayed. But the owners are really clever. The way they manage the orchard, each year they're putting in a few new trees, and just gradually topping up. So by having that mixed age class of trees, you're replicating a habitat which once existed across much of Britain, that wood pasture landscape that was created by the action of large herbivores. because we don't have those large herbivores. Instead, the owners of the orchard are replicating that by pulsing sheep through the orchard in the summer, and by providing those mixed age classes of trees, and by providing really thick hedgerows with lots of different species in them. They're loosely recreating the wood pasture habitat that all of those red listed species that we've met now thrive in. And that's one of the reasons that a traditional orchard system is so productive. When it's left as a low intensity, low managed system, it replicates essentially a wild habitat that we once had across so much of Britain. And the species that need that habitat, those redstart spotted flycatchers, lesser spotted woodpeckers, starlings, missel thrushes, they all benefit by that being there. And so, I'd urge you to, if you do know of organic orchards or traditional orchard systems, please do support them, because overwhelmingly they're a very rare habitat now. We've lost an overwhelming percentage of our orchards since the last war. Cider's gradually falling out of fashion in favor of craft beer and craft ale. And as a result, cider growers and perry-pear growers aren't able to compete. Our fruit growers, so often fruit in supermarkets, it's actually really hard to buy an apple that's been grown in the UK. More often than not, you'll pick up all the pink ladies are grown outside of Britain. Most of our fruit comes from places like South Africa, Brazil. It's stored in these large refrigerated trucks. So do really seek out fruit that's grown in Britain and try and support those growers. Because particularly if it's grown in standard orchards, you're not just supporting a farmer, you're supporting the wildlife that that farmer's looking after as well. Here are a few highs and lows that I came across over the years. Finding that first lesser spotted woodpecker nest was a real treat. They're such a rare bird. They're so difficult to see, but when you find a nest, you can just sit back. I'd often just sit back 100 meters away, dressed up in camo with my scope fixed on the nest. And I just watched them for hours and hours at a time, really reliably coming to and from the nest. And that was a real pleasure. The fact that we found otters using the orchard that year where we put the camera trap out on that piece of burn, that piece of water that flooded in the winter, was amazing. Otters will come huge distances, and I've read a lot more about otters since, and the way they will travel great distances over land, well away from water, if they think they can get to a potential food source. In fact, one of the major predators of rabbit warrens are otters. Otters will work away from particularly up in the north, up in places like Shetland and Islay. Otters will work a rabbit warren and well away from water just to get good food that's in them, hunt the rabbits. And I really enjoy that moment each year when you hear the redstarts pinging through the orchard, the spotted flycatcher seeping. But of course, the highs are always balanced by the lows. You'll have these really hot springs where the tit families will know just to abandon their brood, and you'll get chicks that are maybe a week or two off fledging, and the parents, if they just cannot get enough caterpillar prey, they'll just abandon the nest. And then one year we did have one of our lesser spotted woodpecker nests drummed out by great spotted woodpeckers, which is a real shame because lesser spotted woodpeckers are so rare. It was a real shame, but obviously that is a natural part of the cycle. But the natural balance of the system is out in most places, and when one species starts to really dominate, as great spotted woodpeckers are doing, particularly as a result of benefiting from increased overwintering success thanks to peanut feeders in gardens, we're seeing that knock-on impact on the other species, and sadly that sometimes becomes take out lesser spotted woodpeckers. It's also a pain. I found out that great spotted woodpeckers absolutely love to use these hollow cavities when we put up our large nest boxes as drumming posts. So they will find a nest box that we put up and just spend days on end just hammering away at it, echoing out, because it turns out that a hollow box with a hole in is a really good speaker. And so what we were doing is putting up these loudspeakers around the place, and the great spotted woodpeckers were finding them and going, "Thanks very much," and using them as a broadcast system to announce their territories to their rivals in the area. Sometimes we'd find unusual things. One year we found in the jackdaw colony, we found this large white egg. And it took us a good few weeks to realize that it was we thought, what could the suspects be? Maybe stocked up, they nest in cavities. But eventually we found a mandarin duck was using one of the big cavities in the orchard. And mandarin ducks belong to a group of ducks called the wood ducks. And the wood ducks have got a strategy that if they're really healthy, they will go and egg dump. And egg dumping is a behavior which is supposed to play out with a mandarin duck finding another mandarin duck nest, laying an egg in it and hoping that therefore, her genes will persist by being reared by another female mandarin duck. But if they can't find other mandarin ducks, amazingly, they will egg dump in any nest they can find. They'll go into a cavity. If they find some eggs, they'll drop an egg in it. If they've already produced all of their own eggs and they've still got enough calcium in their bones, birds use their own bone deposits to form their eggshells. And she's healthy and she's finding enough prey to replenish that, she'll go and drop an egg anywhere. And we found one in the middle of a jackdaw nest. And, who knows what became of that duckling, because presumably it didn't last very long. We wanted it hatched out inside a jackdaw nest. Our marsh-tip boxes and our blue-tip boxes, we'd always put them up in pairs, because what happens is blue tits are dominant over marsh tits. And so to get the two nesting in the same area, you just need to put up multiple boxes. And so if you put up 2 or sometimes 3 boxes in any given territory, the blue tit will take the best box, and then the other birds, like marsh tit, will take a secondary box. So their territory is going to overlap as long as they're not competing for nest spaces. And so we made sure that there were always abundant cavities to allow for there to be enough nesting space for the marsh tits. But sometimes that extra box would be taken over not by a bird, but by a mammal. And we would fairly frequently find, maybe once or twice a season, these little guys in our nest boxes. These are yellow-necked mice. They're like a wood mouse on steroids. They're a really big, biggest species of mouse in Britain. And they've got a particularly unusual distribution that sort of goes from Kent up across the Weald through to Gloucestershire into Herefordshire. And unusually as well, they will often group together, and you'd sometimes find 2 or 3 wood mice of these yellow-necked mice nesting together inside one of our nest boxes. One year, Herefordshire Council decided to put some new public footpath signs along, and they picked this tatty old box, but actually that has an active redstart in. So if the boxes weren't damaged each season, I'd just patch them up. I'd tie on a new roof or wedge in a bit of wood just to keep them going. And that's very replicative of what birds are finding in the wild. They're finding those natural cavities, which are usually formed by rot or damage to a tree. So the birds aren't fussy. As long as they feel like it's a secure place to rear their family, they'll happily lay a nest in it. And that one had redstarts in that year. Later in the autumn, I'll often find bats as well. So it's important that you do leave your nest boxes up throughout the year, because dispersing bats, either youngsters or it might be, in this case, I think it's probably male bats, dispersing to find areas in which they can mate. They will just use those cavities. It's amazing how efficiently bats will find, often within a few weeks of putting up a box in the autumn, bats will have found them and they'll use those cavities. So it shows that, those human created habitats, nest boxes, are really important, not just for the birds they're intended for, but for the small mammals and creatures like, yellow-necked mice and bats. I guess the final point that I would like to stress is that orchards can be phenomenally productive landscapes for wildlife, but they're essentially a completely human-managed landscape. Everything about the process of managing an orchard are decisions being taken by people. And those same principles can be taken into any sort of land management, whether it's a balcony, through to a garden, through to an allotment, through to a public green space. Those principles of how we manage that green space can either be done solely for our benefit, as we so often see, or they can be done very much with a view to keeping nature in mind. And just by identifying what nature needs, we can begin to replicate that so that we can share those green spaces with nature, rather than excluding them from the places that we've created. And we often take over a habitat like a parkland. We mow the grass down, we take out all the dead wood, we've lost all the wildflower diversity, we put up non-native trees, and suddenly you turn what could be a beautiful, productive piece of land that can be shared with nature to an area that's only really useful for the odd picnic and walk and a dog. But with a tiny tweak in mindset, by putting in fruit trees, integrating fruit trees into that, by allowing areas of the grass to grow long and creating wildflower meadows in the area, by leaving as much deadwood in the landscape. The councils will often say that it's a health and safety thing. Fine, leave the deadwood on the ground. If there's a tree getting to the end of its life, take it over, leave it lying on the ground, so that we've put deadwood back into the landscape. More than half of the wood in that Biodiversia system that I went to, and sometimes up to 70% in some woodlands, was deadwood. Deadwood is such an important part of the habitat, which has been removed left, right, and centre. whether it's at a garden level or at a park level. So make sure you keep that deadwood back in the system. And finally, it's up to us. We get to choose that. So, if you can have any influence on anyone, creating those public green spaces or your own personal green spaces, just apply some of those principles, some of those things that we learned about in the orchard system that made it tick so well. Those can be applied to any piece of habitat, no matter how big or small. I mentioned some of those species, but there are other species. Cuckoo. Surprising species are on the amber list. So you've got a red list, an amber list, and a green list of how birds are doing in Britain, and the birds are really well studied, which is why they're often used as the metric. But species like mallard duck are wild mallard ducks on the amber list. Dunnocks, bullfinches, tawny owls, these species that are fairly familiar, overall their numbers are still in decline. So it's really important that we provide and maintain the habitats that they use. And finally, I just want to show you this photo. This is the photo that I'm most proud of. So from that early missel thrush, which was out of focus, I gradually refined my techniques, my rigs, my camera setup to get to this point where I got this detail of a very familiar bird, the great tit, in a setting that you probably may not have seen one in, other than perhaps with a nest box rig on Springwatch. This is how, this is what's going on inside one of those cavities as a great tit comes in with some grub to feed to her chicks. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have about it now. But if you do want to follow us, Ben and I are on social media, on our websites. I'm actually in Twitter jail at the moment, so I'm mainly using Instagram these days, but I may go back to using Twitter more if Elon decides to give me my account back. But yeah, I'd just like to open the floor up now and say, if anyone's got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing all those important facts with us. And I particularly love the letter spotted woodpecker video. It's just amazing what you've learned. So yeah, if people want to ask questions, if they could put their hands up and unmute themselves, I'll see if I can spot any hands going up. Oh. Hang on. Or put it in the chat because I'm not seeing any hands up at the moment. No. I don't think we're getting any.
Yeah, Susan's got a hand up.
Oh, Susan, right, go ahead.
Hello. I just wanted to look at your the orchard, which looked absolutely beautiful. But do they ever prune the trees at all?
Yeah, they do. So some of the more productive trees are pruned very frequently, and some of them are, particularly if a tree is getting older or they feel like it's becoming less productive, they will often allow it just to see out its days, as it were, and they allow them to sort of become a bit more sprawling. But yeah, in different parts of the orchard, you've got different ages of tree, and the young and mid-aged trees, which are most productive, are pruned and managed and in a traditional orchard way. And then I sort of probably have a little bit of a bias towards, in my photos, towards the real old growth areas, because that's where I think a lot of the cavities are, and those are the species that I target. Do you ask that because they look unruly?
No. I just wondered because I have, well, starting about 30 years ago, I've planted fruit trees in my garden, and I do try to get them pruned. But, I mean, I have a quince tree which is totally unruly. I have to get somebody else to come and do that. But I've also, the other thing I wanted to ask about was I'm really interested in all little insects. I've been involved in a citizen science project from the Buzz Club at Sussex University with Dave Goulson overseas, and we were doing there's a child who lives next door to me, and he's been helping with this. It was all about earwigs. Now we made earwig hotels out of various things and hung them up. Well, I hung them up in an apple tree, and but this year I live in an area where their springs come up, and we had really bad, well, bad or good, depending on how you look at it, springs in January this year. And but this year, we when we were doing the project, we didn't find a single earwig. And when we came to pick the apples, normally, you know, you find earwigs collect sort of in where the stalk joins and you have lots of earwigs there. And I try not to be too unkind to them, but not a single earwig. And which was really a bit worrying to me, because they eat aphids. We discovered in previous years that they eat the aphids, and so I was a bit sad that there weren't any earwigs.
Yeah, I mean, they're prolific predators, so that could be for a number of reasons. What surrounds? Have you got any aerosol pesticide that could have come through?
Possibly, but I don't think so. I mean, I live in a valley. My neighbours are rather keen on weed killer, but over the road. But I don't put anything at all in my garden. And there's quite a big barrier between me and a field where, well, they do spray stuff sometimes. I don't quite know what, but it's on the whole, it's not an area where there's a lot of spray coming over or anything. It's but I mean, I get lots of bumblebees and all different sorts of bees, which I find very difficult to identify. But I plant things for bees and pollinators in general. So it's I mean, I love the picture you had of the hawk moth, because I get hummingbird hawk moths coming, which are beautiful.
They're crap. We actually, for the first year, I had a friend who had hummingbird hawk moth breed in their garden this year. Most of the hummingbird hawk moths you see have flown across the channel and have come here from Europe, but actually they're a species that are just starting to breed here now, which is quite exciting, because they're cool little things, and they're basically little hummingbirds, aren't they?
Yes, well, they are. Yes. Anyway, it was lovely your talk, and I loved all the pictures of the birds feeding, because it's something you don't really see. I mean, I thought once I was a bit disturbed about the predation of the greater spotted woodpeckers, because I quite encouraged them in my garden, but but I did think once I might have seen a lesser spotted, but because they're very, very shy, and I only saw one once. But I hope that the greater spotted hasn't been predating them.
I mean, if you read bird books from particularly the Victorian era, they will talk about, you know, these mixed winter tit flocks. So it's very common to see sort of great tits and blue tits and long-tailed tits, and sometimes gold crests and tree creepers all grouping together in the winter. You still see it today. But when lesser spotted woodpeckers were in abundance, that's where lesser spotted woodpeckers would go in the winter. You'd get a mixed tit flock coming through, and there'd be 1 or 2 or 3 lesser spotted woodpeckers in there. I mean, even the idea of seeing that today would be remarkable. But they were once our most abundant woodpecker species. They were nicknamed the garden woodpecker. You saw they were very, very common. They would be in every single garden. Far more common than green woodpeckers or great spotted woodpeckers, and obviously wrynecks once bred here, as well as our 4th lost species of woodpecker.
So somebody in the village saw a wryneck last summer, so they're around. But
and as there's lots of good habitat work being done at the moment, and it may be that wrynecks recolonize, but we need to get our invertebrate numbers back up, because our invertebrate numbers are catastrophically low, and those specialist species like spotted flycatcher, like lesser spotted woodpecker, that need invertebrates in a particular place have been hit really hard by that.
Yes, well, I really thought about what I call the splat test. When I was a child, I mean, I'm in my 70s. When I was a child, we used to drive down from near London down to Cornwall to stay with my grandparents, and there was continual wiping of the screen because of all the insects. And now it's a sort of a surprise when you get an insect splatting on your window.
It is.
Which is,
And that is indicative of a big problem that we simply don't have the number of insects that we have, and that's something that we. I can see Hillary's about to ask a question, but that's something that we really tackled in Wild Arts. We need to be paying attention to the fact that our insect populations have collapsed. So it sounds like you're creating, in your own area, good haven for insects. So, yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Hilary, got a question.
Oh, it's mute, I think. Hang on, Hilary, you're muted. 1 second.
Sorry, school by error. Quick question about your nest boxes, Nick, in the orchard. At the end of the summer, do you clean them out? So you've got the bats in the autumn, so do you give them a clean out?
Yeah, I do, but not every year. So you can get, I think the common advice is wait till the end of the season. And by September time, when things have stopped using them, then clean them out. And the reason you do that is obviously if you get fleas or ticks that have built up in that nest over the summer, or if there are dead chicks or rotting eggs in there, you empty those out. But if it's sometimes you'll find a nest box that's just had a moss layer put in it and then not been nested in, and I'll often just leave that there as a good habitat, and you'll find that those are the ones that get used as the overwintering sites, because great tits and blue tits and other species will use those as overwintering sites, so it can help having a bit of insulation in that box for them. So I sort of judge it, and if it looks like a really manky nest, get it out. If it looks okay, leave it in as a bit of a winter blanket for them.
Brilliant, thanks.
Would you put clean hay in the nest boxes or not?
You can do. I have not done that. If I put anything in, I'll sometimes put a thin layer of moss, because that's something that is a really good insulator, and that's a very natural substance that most of the tit species will use as the base of their nests. But if you felt that the nest was too deep, the nest cavity was too deep, and you wanted to insulate it a bit, then you could put in hay. But if it's a very cold box, a concrete box, for example, just get some dry earth or wood chip, put that in the bottom of the box. Definitely, if you're putting up nests for species like owls, owls will not build. They will not put in any nest material. So if you put up an owl box, it's critical that you put in a 2-inch layer of wood chip or soil or fine debris. But for those smaller cavity box species, just a thin layer of moss or nothing at all will do.
Okay, thank you. There's a few little comments on the chat. So have you found any unusual mosses or lichens on the older trees?
I haven't, but I have put some details in the book of the people who know the mosses and lichens. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on the mosses and lichens. But old orchards are fantastic for rare lichens, and I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head which ones those are, but I know that they do have a few there. Did find an orchard tooth fungus, which is a very, very rare species of fungus, which is pretty cool. Brilliant.
Comment from Linda. My local council, Brent Wembley, have changed their management of their parks, thankfully. They're now leaving deadwood down on the ground.
Amazing.
That is
brilliant. That is superb to hear. In fact, that's one of the only councils that I know of who do that. Bristol City Council, I've been asked them for years to try and leave more deadwood. And more often than not, the wood chipper comes in and they just take away the whole tree every time a tree goes down. If you're very lucky, you'll get sort of a 1-foot stump left. But that's great to hear.
Obsession with tidiness. It's such a shame, isn't it?
Ecological tidiness disorder.
Yeah. Another comment from Kate. Thank you for an interesting talk. Do you have any problems with magpie predation? It's a problem in my garden.
We have magpie predation, and of course, magpie predation is a natural part of the system. And there's a sort of a line, when does magpie predation become problem magpie predation? Because in the area where we are, there are good numbers of things like goshawk and buzzard. The magpies have never got to a level where they predate every single nest. They always take a few. We'll often find, somewhere like a quarter of the nests, a third of the nests, if it's first brooders, will get taken by magpies and jays each year. But I don't consider it a problem. It's just sad or frustrating when it happens. But obviously, the magpies are playing their role in the ecosystem as well. But I think, in urban areas, magpies can do particularly well, and they often don't have those natural predators. Particularly around Bristol, there may be one pair of goshawks in Leewoods, but we are limited for natural predators of birds like magpie. And goshawk are the main predator of magpie. Goshawks hate magpies. They'll take them out of a hole. They'll take all the magpies out of a woodland if the magpies try and nest there. So by not having goshawks, we do get higher numbers of magpies. And once that system is out of kilter, that's when it becomes a problem. And magpies are very clever. They'll watch the birds back to the nest and they can take out every one. So can be a problem.
Can be a problem. So one other little comment from Linda: we have hummingbird hawk moths in our allotment this year, so that's a really good sign.
I
Isn't
think
it?
we're going to get more coming. You know, these warm, dry summers, and you get more coming up across the channel, and increasingly we're going to see them. It won't be long before they successfully overwinter.
Interesting. Anyone else got any questions or comments? I think I've read everything out. Oh, right. Thank you very, very much, Nick. That's been such an interesting evening. I've really, really enjoyed it. So we'll put the recording on the Avonlea Trees website. So if anyone knows anyone who wished they'd been able to hear this, then let them know. We'll put that on within the next week or so. So there's still a chance to hear the talk.
Great. You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye then. Bye, everyone.